Dreams in my head, Anika Moa, 8:15, Queensland-wide. My name's Steve Austin. Hello. To the big picture view of the budget, what's in there that what's not in there, but we can read into it. Two wise men from different areas of life join me tonight. Before I do that, I should just mention that Newswires are pointing out that Warren Buffett has been warning of inflation ahead, by the way. Apparently, he's concerned at the governments around the world that are simply printing money, which he says is implementing inflationary policy. Quote, governments are printing money everywhere, borrowing stupendous amounts. Throughout history, that has led to problems, and it will this time too. Well, I know one of my guests here is a particular fan of Mr. Buffett, so let me introduce them. Chris Leithner, financier and investor from Leithner and Associates. Chris, thanks for coming in.
Oh, thank you, Steve.
And John Black, former political organiser and Senator for the Labor Party in Queensland, now has a company called Australian Development Strategies. John, welcome to you as well.
Yep, thanks, Steve.
Thank you for both of you for coming in. First of all, can I just get your brief overview comments on the budget itself? John, first of all, how do you see it, if I may, please?
Well, I think it's managed to escape the attention of most Australians so far. I think people have been more interested, in the football or watching the repeats of Underbelly last night. I don't think the budget rated its socks off. Wasn't helped by the fact that we read all about it in the papers beforehand, so we pretty much we knew everything, or we thought we did. It's pretty much. I mean, they've spent 20 odd billion bucks. They've got a deficit of about 58 billion. They're apparently the 20 billion that they spent didn't contribute anything to the deficit of 58. It was all down to the collapse in revenues, apparently. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the way I look at it is it is going to force up. It's going to force up interest rates, and as Warren Buffett says, hey, I don't want to argue with him. It's going to be inflationary as well, but it's going to take a while. So. They've put off the pain, which wasn't all that severe anyway, for a year or so. Chris Richardson from Access Economics described it as the cream puff budget. Yeah, so... In other words, they haven't taken the hard decisions. They haven't made the pension rates. The pension's going to go up, in a few years' time. And, I mean, if you were born after June 30, 1952, then you may have problems. But if you manage to get by about 6 months or so, you're okay for a while. Family tax A is going to get reduced, but it's going to be done at the margins. Family tax B, ditto. There's been some cutbacks in people who spend a lot for programs like IVF and that sort of thing. I mean, but it's pretty hard to kind of get upset about it, isn't it? Really, if you have a look at the political side of it, who's got hit? I guess the top quartiles got hit a bit, the professionals, the inner city people. I don't think they're going to like it. I don't think those people who are in their 50s are going to like it if they're looking forward to their retirement. The bottom end, family tax A, they're not going to like it, but, are they going to realise what's happened to them for a while? I don't think so.
That's the politics. John, thanks. I'll come back to you in a moment and put some specific questions to you. Chris Leithner on the big picture economics. Just give me your sort of gut reaction to the budget last night. Well, the one that everyone was underwhelmed by. They were watching, TV and other things.
The basic point, it seems to me, is that the Australian government is doing much the same thing as other Western governments. Basically, their policies premised upon two fallacies. One is that they can spend their way out of tough times.
The wisdom of crowds, Chris Leithner. They're doing it, so I'll do it.
Or lemmings falling off the cliff. Take your pick about the analogy. And the second one is that by intervening in markets for credit, that's to say depressing rates of interest below a market clearing level, they can prop up asset prices. The Americans are doing this. It's happening in Britain, and now it's happening here in Australia. So in slightly political terms, there are basically two parties in this country. There's a stupid party. I'll leave it to you to decide which one that is. There's an evil party. Decide which one that is. They occasionally...
Well, we've got a choice of evil or stupid.
These days, they do things that are simultaneously stupid and evil. This is what we call bipartisanship. So that the arguments about the budget are simply Clayton's arguments that all and sundry in Australia agree about, more has to be spent. It's not about pulling belts back. It's about consuming and borrowing. It's not about saving and producing. Where shall we intervene? You say tomato, I say tomato. Some people say stimulus. I say pork barreling. Where will the pork barreling, will it be in this electorate or in that electorate? In other words, these are arguments which are based upon basically fallacies. They're run by economic illiterates.
Well, I'll come to those.
And the sum total, I emphatically agree, will be these are policies which are going to place upward pressure on interest rates and strong strongly upward pressure on headline rates of inflation.
I love getting you in. Chris Leithner and John Black are my guests. John, you observed in a piece in the Financial Review recently that Labor Party's budget, British Labor's budget, had real poll implications for Gordon Brown, you think, which may confront Kevin within a week. Kevin Rudd, Australia's Prime Minister. Why?
Well, basically the British budget was a lot more unpopular, I think, than this one's going to be. So I don't think that he's going to cop the same kind of adverse reaction that Brown's copped. I mean, Brown has been there for a long time, and he's past the use-by date, and the public are clearly going to chuck him out whenever they get the chance. And Kevin's a long way away from that. But, a soak the rich budget, well, it hasn't really soaked the rich, has it, really? It's just annoyed them. It is... I can't see that it's going to make a lot of difference demographically, other than inner cities. I think they're going to lose some support. This is in the short term. In the longer term, you can see problems with all the young kids who have bought their first home. They couldn't really afford it, but the incentive was there. They've taken the gamble. They've bought the home. Now, what's going to happen next year, surely as night follows day, if you're running deficits of $58 billion a year, interest rates are going to go up. These kids are going to get slugged.
So the people who've taken the first home buyers grant...
Mate, they're going to get bitten.
They're stretched, so they've got in because they think, if I don't get in now, I won't get the grant.
Yeah.
But when interest rates are going to go up, they'll be in trouble.
Absolutely. And if they lose their job, of course, well, they've lost their house. See, we've been profiling mortgage stress as well as unemployment, and what's happening now with mortgage stress is it's getting driven not by high interest rate but by unemployment. And this recession is essentially a middle white-collar recession. People have been sacking clerks. They haven't been sacking blue-collar workers. They haven't been sacking the skilled managerial workers or the professionals. They're all doing okay. They've been sacking the clerks. Okay, so these are the kind of people who live in the new, outer suburban, housing estates that just sort of go on and on. They put a forest in it or a lake or whatever. That's, the sort of place I'm talking about.
Yes.
These people are the ones who are really doing it tough. So, and they're the ones who are going to get hit by this recession. Interest rates go up, they're going to get a double whammy.
But there's no political impact as such
for
Labor on that, is there?
Not
because
yet, no.
Those people, when they get upset, they go to vote for the Greens and such like, and when it comes to election time, the Greens send their preferences to Labor.
Yeah, well, at the last state election, there were swings against the Labor Party in the central city areas. Where basically where the richer people now live. All of the blue collar workers, the skilled blue collar workers, are being pushed aside, and now you've got richer professionals living in the inner city. They normally would be expected to vote Green. They didn't vote Green anywhere near as much. They're moving from the left to the right. You can see that happening.
Really?
It's been happening in the last federal election. It happened in the last state election, and I think it's going to continue to happen.
How does the opposition respond tomorrow night? What can they do response-wise politically? Joe Hockey at 7:30 tomorrow night on this radio station is going to, in Parliament, he's going to get up and give the opposition's response.
Well, I think interest rates, basically, are the thing that they've got to hammer. They've got to hammer the link between higher interest rates and the deficit, and also the risk of higher inflation. And, I think that's something that's a fair way off, and people aren't necessarily going to identify with it quickly. So they just have to actually keep pointing it out to people that it's going to happen, and then if and when it does come to pass, they'll be acknowledged as having foreshadowed it. So there'll be some return in it for them. I think, a lot of the cutbacks have been rats and mice stuff, but, if you're a professional woman, earning 150 grand or thereabouts, you have not done well out of this budget. You have not done well out of this budget. You get cut back in a number of ways in terms of, private health insurance, in terms of, being a primary carer if you want to have the child. You simply don't get this parental payment thing. You're not going to get it. But if your husband earns 150, well, that's okay. So, my wife pointed this out to me in no uncertain terms this evening over the dinner table. This is not a budget that's kind to skilled professional women. So, they could play that up a bit, and the pensions thing, obviously, the cutbacks for family tax, all of those things. But hey, I don't think people are listening at the moment, I have to say.
Not listening.
No.
John Black from Australian Development Strategies. Chris Leithner, the big picture economic view. You've been warning for some time about governments printing money around the world. In fact, you've been not even lamenting, you've been denouncing them, saying that just simply printing money is absolute nonsense, that this is madness, that you think that people should, follow the rules of their grandmother, if you like, reduce your debt, save your money, build your asset base, as it were. How do you see the big picture view of the budget, what it means?
Well, unfortunately, not that much, just in terms of what's just been said. That's to say, the government had a chance, if it chose to take it, to say to people, look, the policies, to a considerable extent over the past 10 or 15 years, based upon debt, based upon consumption, have been erroneous. They've got us into this hole. It's now incumbent upon individuals, not the government, to dig themselves out of this hole. What does that mean? In an economic sense, it comes close to meaning cold turkey. But, of course, none of that has entered any heads in Canberra of any political persuasion. In other words, very hard choices are coming, whether people like it or not.
This wasn't the hard choice budget, was it? They said it was going to be a tough, hard budget. It just wasn't the hard choice budget. It was the cream puff budget, as Chris Richardson said.
There haven't been, if you like, hard decisions taken, I'll go out on a limb, since Peter Walsh made them in the early 1980s. In other words, a politician who looks someone straight in the eye and says no, and possibly adds a few unutterable things.
Mate, he's saying more than no.
I can't say that on the radio.
I'm here to tell you.
Precisely right. And this government doesn't have the equivalent of a Peter Walsh. The Liberal Party doesn't have the equivalent of a Peter Walsh. Someone who says, look, there is such a thing as fiscal rectitude. It hasn't been practiced in this country for quite a long time. People have forgotten all about it. Politicians simply haven't been around that block, and so they're simply stunned by these sorts of developments. They're reacting to them. They have no real response.
All right, now you've looked at the big picture of the major nations like Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, etc. The G20, I guess, courtesy of IMF data. What do you see in terms of debt? How much debt are these countries carrying, Australia included?
The borrowing requirement is on the order of $11 trillion US. That's, if you like, to bail out banks and financial institutions. It's not for other stimulus sorts of projects. In other words, there is an absolutely mammoth borrowing requirement headed the world's way. What does that do? It basically says to people who have savings, here comes a tidal wave. The only way that people will eventually buy that amount of debt is to insist upon better terms. And what are the better terms? They include higher rates of interest. So in other words, even if not a single dollar were to be borrowed in Australia, and now the benchmark seems to be closer to $300 billion than it is to the current borrowing limit of $200 billion, simply because so many other countries in the world are borrowing so massively, that puts upward pressure upon rates. That eventually, just as has been said, it'll put upward pressure upon mortgage rates, it'll put upward pressure upon the rates businesses have to pay. All of that implies asset prices are not going to continue to skyrocket as they have in the stock exchange, that they stagnate or fall. It implies then, whether we like it or not, and most people won't like it, that belts are going to be tightened quite significantly. In other words, if we think about it in cricketing terms, we're barely at drinks on the first day of a 5-day test. In other words, for someone who says, the worst is past, it seems to me that's
nonsense.
Precisely right.
Yeah, if the government runs its full term, which is another question altogether, second half of next year, you're likely to be seeing rising unemployment and possibly rising interest rates. Now, the government can handle rising unemployment because that's been blamed on somebody else. I don't think they're necessarily in a position where they can get away with explaining away both rising unemployment and rising interest rates, especially if the CPI starts to look up. You know, I just point out that this whole crisis started because a well-meaning, international leader and national leader, Bill Clinton, decided he wanted people who couldn't really afford houses in the United States to have houses. So they got subsidies, right? People got bullied into giving them home loans when they shouldn't have. And guess what's happened in Australia?
A low-end asset price
First home buyers scheme, absolutely. They're all going to get caught. So, I mean, there's some fertile ground there for the opposition, and as I said, the operative phrase is if the government runs its full term.
John Black is with Australian Development Strategies. Chris Leithner from Leithner Associates. Chris, the Commonwealth's financial or fiscal position, which I hate that word, is deteriorating rapidly. How rapidly?
On the order of the debt, if you like, debt position as a percentage of the economic pie, going from the current, say, 6-ish% to on the order of 15%, according to some very favourable projections outlined yesterday. Assume that the bad news is always underestimated, so push that towards, say, 20 into the low 20s. But again, I'm simply extrapolating there. I'm simply saying that, what's regarded as bad news could be considerably worse than that. Remember, Australian individuals and families and businesses businesses are heavily indebted. Yes, it's true that the government is less indebted than, say, the US government, the British government, and so on. Sure. But Australians as individuals are among the Western world's most heavily debt-laden people. So that when one talks about interest rates rising, a given percentage change has a much bigger bad impact today than it would have, say, in the days of 15 or 17% mortgage rates.
All right, now John's point is that people aren't listening to this budget. Mr. John and Mary Citizen couldn't care less. You know, they're too busy watching the horror of rugby league football and other things and good television shows. But do you agree that inflation pressures halfway through next year?
I agree that inflation has been raging for quite a long time in terms of what central banks are doing, pumping up their balance sheets, basically increasing the supply of money. The consequence of that inflation in terms of rises of particular prices, rises of interest rates, that's coming. I can't give you precise date at which it arrives, but certainly that's the risk. And notice then the combination of these two things, the stagnation that comes with unemployment, etc., plus the consequences of inflation. That's a rewrite, not of the 1930s, which is the good news, but the bad news, it's a rerun of the 1970s. And remember, the 1970s recessions, plural, and early 1980s, it was not the case that, oh, yes, there was a bit of economic bad times for 3 or 6 months and we put it behind us. No, it was a hard slog for the better part of a decade. Yeah,
because the Vietnam War was funded by printing money in America, basically.
So what do homeowners do, particularly those who've taken advantage of, to either of you, they've taken advantage of the, well, that's the wrong term, isn't it? They've opted for the first homeowners grant. They've bought a house while they thought they could. They're going to get hit with inflation in 12 months' time, we think. What do? Sell the house quick before the end of the year? Get out of debt?
Well, I'd be trying to put a bit into the offset account. I think that'd be prudent advice. Save.
But I mean, all the people I interview say that the house prices are going down. It's not going to go up any further.
Well, the profiling that we've done of unemployment shows that the people who are getting hit by unemployment are those around the third quartile, in terms of house prices, not so much the bottom 50% or so. At the moment, the bottom 50% or so is holding firm because that's where the demand is from the first-home buyers and others, but the top end of the market's going down. Basically, I think people ought to be aware of the fact that with this amount of money that the government has to borrow, that it's going to push up interest rates, and that's going to have effect for their ability to finance their own home. And if they've bought a home as a result of subsidies, they need to be aware of that, basically.
Chris Leithner, this is a question without notice. Have you checked to see what the financial markets were doing today? How do investors respond? Or have you looked?
The short answer is a low-key response, both with respect to credit markets and stock markets. But the basic point, I think, is a very good one. That's to say, or the point that's just been made. It's ultimately savings which is going to dig people out of the hole in which either they have dug themselves or may dig themselves. Things like savings, things like production. It's not digging oneself further into debt. Much greater vigilance against politicians and basically a sense of prudence, something that has gone out of fashion, has been alien to people for the better part of a generation.
John, can I just ask you briefly before I let you go, there was almost nothing in it for small business. If small business is going to be the generator of new jobs and it employs 50% of the people, there was almost nothing in the budget for small business people. One or two minor things.
There were some investment incentives I saw. I could apparently go out and buy a new car, apparently. But, I mean, there are a few other things, but none of which bears any relevance to the way I run my small business.
So, I mean, small business, if governments want to be re-elected, they need to look after small business, don't they?
Well, they do. I mean, small business generates a lot of the jobs. Right. And, yeah, I would have thought so, but it doesn't seem to be sort of high on the agenda.
I appreciate your time. John Black from Australian Development Strategies, thank you very much for coming in. Chris Leithner from Leithner and Associates. Chris, thanks to you as well.
Thank you.